bed was empty when I went in with the tea at 9:30, and the hook by the front door had no coat on it, and the door itself was unlatched, and I knew the way you know a thing in the bones before the brain agrees that he had gone again. I am Margaret Lockhart Vane, and the man I am describing is my father, Thomas Lockhart, 81 years old this November, formerly a corporal of pioneers, lately a man who cannot always find the kettle in his own kitchen. He had walked out of the house at some hour I could not yet establish, in his old blue coat with the small regimental badge still pinned to the lapel where my mother had pinned it 46 years ago, and his old cap on his white hair, and no wallet, and no telephone, and no idea, by then, of which way was home. I do not want you to picture a frail man. He had the long straight back of a pioneer corporal who had spent his working life laying culverts and bridges in country my generation never learned to pronounce, and he had hands the size of dinner plates, and he could still, on a good morning, lift a sack of coal one-handed. He was not frail, he was lost. That is a different thing and a worse one, and the difference is what the next 2 hours of my life were spent learning. I telephoned the police from the hallway while I was still putting my shoes on. I gave them the description: blue coat, old regimental cap, badge with a gold mattock on a dark blue field, white hair, height, the slight stoop he had got since the spring, and I gave them the 3 places he had ever wandered to before: the war memorial in our own borough, the canal towpath, the bench by the river where he had sat with my mother on Sundays. I rang the missing veteran network, there is such a network, run out of a small office in the cathedral close by a retired regimental sergeant major named Pug, and you may pray if you ever have a father like mine that you never need the number, and the woman who answered took the description without my having to repeat anything, and said very calmly, "We will start the telephone tree. Drive." I drove. I will not pretend to you that I drove well. I had 2 phones on the passenger seat and a thermos of his tea in the cup holder, and the spare pair of his reading glasses in my pocket because, in some illogical pocket of my mind, I had decided he might need them. I was operating on the thin, clean fuel of a daughter's panic, which is not the same fuel a person uses on an ordinary morning, and which burns out fast. I drove the way a woman drives when her father has been gone 4 hours, and she has been pretending to herself, for the past 6 months, that the diagnosis is not what the diagnosis is. I drove past the war memorial twice. I drove the towpath as slowly as the car would go in 2nd gear. I drove the river bench. I drove the small park where 20 years ago he had taught my own son to throw a cricket ball, in the days when my son had been small and my father had been a man who could still drive. He was not in any of those places. The telephone in the seat next to me did not ring. It was, by then, 11 o'clock, and somewhere in the city my father was walking, and I did not know where. This is the part I did not see. This is the part Guardsman Ian Drummond, of the 2nd Company of the Household Guard of the House of Elderwood, told me afterwards very quietly, standing at attention beside the railing with his eyes on the cobbles between us because he was a man, he said, who was not in the habit of explaining himself. I asked him to. I told him I needed to know. And he told me, in the short, careful sentences of a soldier who would have preferred to say nothing at all. He had come on the gate post at 9 o'clock. The morning had been bright and clear, and the forecourt of the palace had been thin of crowds. It was a Tuesday, midweek, pre-noon, and the state diary was empty until the afternoon investiture. The 2 posts at the main gate were Drummond on the south and Guardsman Fooley's on the north. He had stood the way he had stood for 9 years on that post, with his eyes on a point on the cobbles 10 feet in front of his boots, and his white-gloved hand on the rifle, and his mind on the long, dull, disciplined nothing which is the inside of a guardsman's mind on a quiet morning. He had noticed my father at 10:20. He noticed him because the old man was walking the railing the wrong way. Tourists, Drummond said, walked the railing in a pattern. They came up to it, photographed the guard from one of 4 favored angles and moved on. My father had been drifting along the railing, stopping, turning, looking up at the palace and then down at his own hands, and then walking on and then stopping again. He was wearing a blue coat and an old regimental cap, and Drummond, whose eyes did not move from the cobbles 10 feet in front of his boots, registered the cap the way a soldier registers a uniform, peripherally, instinctively, the silhouette and the badge before the man inside. The badge was a small dark blue oval, with a gold mattock and a gold spade crossed at the head of it, and a thin ring of gold around the rim. Drummond knew that badge. His own grandfather, he told me, had served with the 11th Highland Pioneers in the war 48 years before, not in the same company as my father, but in the same brigade on the same line, on the same rotten week of bridge work along a river whose name I do not feel licensed to put in writing. The badge had been on his grandfather's coat too, in the photograph above his grandmother's kitchen sink, and his grandfather had told him more than once that a man wearing a pioneer's mattock on his lapel was a man you stopped for in any street, in any city, at any hour. He did not move from his post, he held. The old man drifted along the railing in his direction, and then stopped, perhaps 8 feet from the gate, and stood. Drummond said this carefully, because he is a careful man, stood with the slight loose stand of a person who has forgotten, for the moment, what he is standing for. The old man's hand was on the gilded iron of the railing. His other hand was at the lapel of his coat, fingering the badge. Drummond gave the briefest signal, with 2 fingers of his white glove against the side of his rifle, to Foolies on the north post. It is a signal between paired guardsmen that means I am about to step off, cover the gate. He had used it twice in 9 years. The first time had been to help a tourist who had fainted in the August heat. This was the second. He stepped to the railing. He did not address my father by any name because he did not yet know one, and he did not ask him what he was doing, because Drummond is not a man who wastes a question on a person whose answer is plain on his face. He spoke through the railing, in a low, even voice, the motto of the 11th Highland Pioneers, in the proper old phrasing, 6 words in a language my father had not heard out of another man's mouth for the better part of 40 years. My father looked up. He looked at the bearskin. He looked at the red wool of the tunic and the medals. He looked at the white-gloved hand on the rifle and at the disciplined face above the chin-strap. And then he looked at Drummond's eyes, and he said slowly the next line of the motto, the answering line, in the same old phrasing, in his own voice, the corporal's voice from a country 48 years gone, the voice I had not heard him use in 8 years and had thought in the last 6 months that I would never hear him use again. He did not know in that moment where he was. He did not know that he was at the gate of a palace, in a city he had lived in for 40 years, 8 streets from the home I was at that moment driving away from in a panic. He did not know what year it was. He did not know me, not in that moment, and would not have known me if I had stood beside him. He knew the man on the other side of the railing was a brother. That was enough. Drummond spoke to him quietly through the bars. He asked him his name. My father gave him his name, first name, surname, rank, regiment, company, the way a corporal of pioneers gives his name to a sentry in the order the corporal had been taught, and Drummond memorized it and held it. He asked him whether he had family. My father said after a long moment that he had a daughter and that her name was Margaret, and that she was a good girl and she would be cross with him about the kettle. Drummond said, "Yes, sir, she will." My father laughed. A household steward was crossing the forecourt on some unrelated errand, a man I later learned was the understeward for inner liveries of the House of Elderwood, and Drummond signaled to him, a small lift of 2 fingers, and the steward came over. Drummond did not break the rhythm of his quiet conversation with my father. He said to the steward sideways, without turning his head, "An old soldier has come to the gate disoriented. The 11th Highland Pioneers, Corporal Thomas Lockhart. His daughter Margaret, find her. Use the network." The steward, who, like all good stewards, understood an instruction the first time and did not require a second, said, "At once, guardsman," and went, walking fast and not running, back across the forecourt toward the small door that leads down to the household exchange. Drummond stayed at the railing. He spoke to my father between long quiet pauses about the badge, about the year he had been issued the cap, about the wet spring and the boots that had not been ready until the 2nd week. They went on like that, the 2 of them on either side of the iron, the old corporal and the young guardsman, for the next half-hour in the short, careful sentences of soldiers about a regiment my father had not been able last week to name. The telephone tree found me at 4 minutes to 12. I was on the towpath for the 3rd time when the call came in. It came through the missing veteran network, then through Mrs. Pugg in the cathedral close, then through to my mobile in the cradle on the dashboard, and a calm woman's voice said, "Mrs. Lockhart Vane, your father is at the main gate of the House of Elderwood. He is well. A guardsman has him." I do not remember answering. I do not remember turning the car. I remember the steering wheel under my hands and a particular set of red lights on the embankment road, and then I remember the long curve of the forecourt approach and the gilded iron of the gate, and a man in a blue coat standing very straight beside the railing with his hand on the iron, and another man on the inside of the gate, in red wool and brass and a bearskin and white gloves, standing at the formal stand of a guardsman on post, and the 2 of them, my father and the guardsman, facing each other through the bars at the polite distance of 2 men who have nothing to say, and a great deal of understanding between them. My father was calm. I had not seen him that calm in 6 months. I parked badly. I got out badly. I went to the railing badly, the way a woman who has been afraid for 4 hours goes anywhere, half running, half sobbing, my coat open and my hair in my face. My father looked at me, and for one terrible half-second he did not know me, and then he did, and his face, the long, kind, ruined face of my father, broke into the slow, careful smile of a man who has remembered, after a long absence, the name of his own daughter. He said, "Maggie, the kettle." I said, "Yes, Dad, the kettle." I turned to the guardsman. I was by then crying in the unbeautiful way that women cry when they are very tired and very grateful. And I said the things you say, "Thank you, oh thank you," and I tried to tell him who my father was and what he had been and what he had done in his life and how much it meant. Drummond did not move from his post. He did not, the entire time, look at me directly. He stood at attention, eyes forward, with the slight softening at the mouth that is the only expression a guardsman is permitted to wear in public. And when I had stopped, when I had run dry of words and was only standing there, with my hand on my father's arm through the railing, Drummond brought his right hand up in a single clean economical motion to the brim of his bearskin, and he saluted my father. It was not a salute to a civilian. It was the cap badge to cap badge salute that one regiment renders to another across a parade ground, across a line of march, across 2 generations. My father, who had not stood properly to attention in 15 years, came to attention beside me and returned it. His back was straight. His hand was steady. His face in that 1 second was the face of the corporal of pioneers my mother had married, the one in the photograph on our mantel, the one I had thought was gone. The salute ended. Drummond's hand came back to the rifle. He said very quietly, "Welcome home, Corporal." My father said in the same quiet voice, "Thank you, son," that was all. I asked Drummond if there was anything at all that I could do, that I could send, that I could write to his commanding officer. He said no, ma'am. He said it had been his honor. He said it in the way a soldier says a thing he has decided in advance he is going to say, and then he said, with his eyes still on the cobbles 10 feet in front of his boots, "My grandfather served alongside your father's brigade. The badge is well known in our family." And then he closed his mouth, and that was from him the whole of the explanation. I drove my father home. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and his coat buttoned up to the throat, and twice on the drive he turned to me and said, "Maggie, the kettle," and twice I said, "Yes, Dad." The kettle. I made him tea when we got in. I sat with him at the kitchen table for an hour while the kettle steamed and the badge on his coat caught the noon light through the window, and I thought about a young man in a bearskin who had broken his discipline for 90 quiet seconds at a gate, and about the long line of brotherhood that had run between 2 old soldiers, one inside the railing and one outside, across 48 years, and a war I had only ever known as a date in a book. I thought about Drummond's grandfather, whom I would never meet, and about the small dark blue badge with the gold mattock that had, that morning, done what neither the police nor the veteran network nor my own 4 hours of driving had been able to do, which was bring my father home. My father died 14 months later. He died at home, in the bed I had found empty that morning, with the blue coat on the hook by the door and the badge still on the lapel where my mother had pinned it. We buried him in the regimental cap. I wrote, the week after the funeral, to the captain of the household guard of the House of Elderwood, and I told him what Guardsman Drummond had done, and I asked that the captain note it in the man's file in whatever way the captain saw fit. The captain wrote back a short letter. He said the matter had already been noted. He said the household considered it the proper conduct of a guardsman on a quiet morning, and he thanked me for writing. I keep the badge now. It is in a small box on my own mantel, next to the photograph of my father in the field. I take it out sometimes when I am cleaning, and I hold it in my hand and look at the small gold mattock and the small gold spade on the dark blue field, and I think about the brotherhood that ran between the men who wore it, and the longer brotherhood that ran between their grandsons, 2 generations down the line, on either side of an iron railing on a Tuesday morning. I do not pretend any longer to understand what passed between those 2 men at the railing, the recognition across 2 generations, the moment when one disciplined man saw, in another man's failing memory, the corporal he had once been and was still underneath. I have only the badge and the photograph, and a great quiet respect for the young man at the gate of the House of Elderwood who knew, on a Tuesday morning, exactly who my father was, when my father could not, for the moment, remember it himself. I have told this story since to other women in my position, daughters of fathers whose memories are going, wives of husbands the same, and I tell it because the rest of the long, slow road I am on with my father was not, in fact, full of guardsmen at railings. The rest of it was hard and small and private, and not the subject of any story. But that one Tuesday morning, in the middle of a year of losing him, the world handed me back a piece of my father I had thought was already gone, through the hand of a stranger at a gate, and I am not going to forget it, and I am not going to let anyone in this family forget it either. That is the whole of the story. I have written it down because I do not want to forget any part of it, and because, if you have a father like mine, or a husband, or a brother, I want you to know that the world still contains men who will recognize a badge and step to a railing and salute.